As I look all around this room, I see lots of different kinds of people from lots of different places. But I know there is one thing, at least, that unites all of us. We are all obsessed with beating Donald Trump. I know I personally fantasize about it multiple hours, at least every day. And sometimes it feels like it's so close I can almost taste it. It's just around the corner. But actually, the general election is about 1 million light years away in political terms. And first, we have to get to and then through a Democratic primary. And that seems like it's just around the corner. There's debates next week. We're all watching many CNN town halls. It's almost there. But in actuality, it is going to be 7 months before a single voter casts a ballot, even in the primary. Now, if you, like me, like to count things down, which I do on my whiteboard in my office, that is 32 weeks. It's 229 days. It's more than 5,000 hours and way, way too many minutes to count. We have a long time before anyone is actually going to cast a ballot, and that's a problem. Because in our anxiety-ridden state, we are just waiting to figure out what do Democratic primary voters want. And so we're looking to anything we can see in order to try to understand them. Yet in this pre-primary season that we're currently in, the folks that are paying attention are a specific kind of hyper-engaged voter. And they're not necessarily a proxy for everyone else in the Democratic electorate, most of whom haven't even tuned in yet. And that creates a risk. There is a potential that the hyper engaged, the extremely online voters that are paying attention right now might be able to drive the directions of the campaigns. They're the ones going to candidates' events, they're giving small dollar donations, they're participating in the online conversation, and they could shape where the candidates go and where the campaign as a whole goes. And unfortunately, it could be in a direction that has very little to do with what the rest of the Democratic primary voters actually really want. So if we unquestioningly follow these extremely online voters and think that, in fact, they are a reflection of primary voters, we could spend 7 months staring into a funhouse mirror and getting very confused about what, in fact, we're searching for, and get led in the wrong direction. So I'm here today to share some news that we have about the real picture of what primary voters look like, the real people beyond the funhouse that these candidates are going to need to woo in order to win the nomination and then eventually the election. So I'm going to take you through what does this Democratic primary electorate really look like? What do those voters want? Why is it so different than what we hear every single day? And what are the repercussions of that disconnect on key specific issues that are going to be a big deal both in the primary and in the general election? So we've launched a project to do quarterly deep dive surveys with these primary voters, knowing that they're not going to pull the lever for a very long time. We're working with David Binder Research to find regular tap on what it is they care about and what they want. And we're releasing our latest version of that poll this morning. It's a poll of national Democratic primary voters, and it shows a picture that might actually surprise you. So when you hear a lot about young voters in the Democratic primary electorate, certainly a lot of young voters, 19% of these primary voters are under the age of 35, but almost half are over 55. We have a very diverse racial coalition we need to assemble. It's much more diverse than the general electorate. About 2/3 at this point are white voters in this primary overall, and about 1/3 are people of color. And when you look at where they live, they are spread across the country. So it's not just on the coasts, not just California and the Acela corridor. A quarter of them are where I'm from, in the Midwest. A quarter of them are from here, in the South. They are running the entire gamut of our American communities. And when you ask them about their own worldview and their ideology, only 4 in 10 Democratic primary voters say that they are self-described liberals. So what does this primary electorate want? Well, like us, they are laser focused on one thing, and that is beating Trump. No matter how you ask it, they all say, I don't actually care if someone agrees with every single policy provision I have, I just want to beat him. 63% say that's the thing they want to do more than anything, even if the candidate disagrees with them on some key policies. So how do they think we can do that? How are we going to win? Well, you ask them how we're going to beat Trump, and 2/3 say we need to build a broad coalition of voters, and that includes some voters who may have voted for Donald Trump the first time around. Only a quarter of the Democratic primary electorate says, nope, we need to put those voters aside and just go left, and that's how we're going to win, is just energize the base. They're also a very pragmatic bunch. When you ask them, what should people be doing and talking about in order to beat Trump, 3/4 of them say, we got to work across party lines because we want to actually get things done. And you may be reading a lot about people who want to move the Overton window, but when you ask these folks what they're concerned about, they want their nominee to focus on urgent problems that Americans face every single day, not shifting some academic debate in a certain direction. 6 in 10 on the economy say exactly what Mayor Steve Benjamin said. They say we need to focus relentlessly on expanding opportunity to every single person in every place in the country. Way more than the number of people who say, you know, my first priority is reducing income inequality. And they do not want to get everything for free. So when you ask them on a 1 through 10 scale, how important is hard work to getting ahead? The average is 8.6. These folks are deeply committed to the dignity and value of work, and they want to work for that opportunity and make a good life for themselves. So this does not sound like a chorus for a democratic socialist agenda to me. So on the issues, we talked a little bit about their worldview. On the issues, they are actually very mainstream. Similar pragmatism that we were talking about. On the issues, when you talk about healthcare, which is most important to a lot of these voters, they say their top 2 priorities are reducing healthcare costs and reducing taxes on the middle and working class. When you ask them what they want on healthcare in particular, they say, I want to cap the costs of healthcare for everyone and cover everyone. They think that's more important, actually, than overturning the ACA and doing single payer. On college, a very small proportion of them say, I actually want free college. Most of them say, I want to help people who get into college actually complete. And then when you ask them about what should we do on jobs, the private sector jobs is really where they're focused. A very small proportion say, I want a federal jobs guarantee. And only 3 in 10 on immigration say, I want to abolish ICE. So why is this so different than the picture that we see every single day and what we hear in the media? Well, welcome to the funhouse. The Twitter debate has a very different look than the debate that we just talked about. These folks in behavior and also in their ideology and their issue priorities look very, very different than the Democratic primary voters that we were just talking about. So it is very hard to remember because we are always tweeting, and in fact, you are probably tweeting right now. Only 12% of Democratic primary voters tweet every single day. 12%. That's a lot of people that are not even engaged in this Twitter debate. And these folks actually behave very differently than the entire Democratic electorate. 6 in 10 are already watching this election very closely. compared to only 41% of the overall Democratic primary electorate. 56% have already visited at least one presidential campaign website. That's more than double the amount that did of all Democratic primary voters. They are 10 points more likely to call themselves liberal, and they look really demographically different than the Democratic primary electorate. They are more male, they are more urban, and they are way, way younger. So in the overall numbers, you saw 19% are under 35. Amongst this Twitter group, 40%. So this is not the group of folks that is representative of the entire electorate. Only 4 in 10 have ever been married or partnered. And a full 54% of these folks call themselves democratic socialists. That is 24 points higher than amongst the Democratic primary electorate. So it is not surprising that this very unrepresentative group has some pretty unrepresentative attitudes and views. When you ask them these questions about whether we should have a broad coalition rather than go to the left, 2/3 of primary voters say let's have a broad coalition. Less than half of folks on Twitter agree with that. And when you look at just the people who do not ever tweet amongst the Democratic electorate, that's most of us, 74% say we need to build a broad coalition, and that includes people who may have the first time voted for Donald Trump. That's very different than the folks on Twitter. They still prioritize beating Donald Trump. They think it's important, but just barely. They just barely care about that more than they care about specific agreement on policy issues. And nearly half of them say that we actually need to go to the left in order to beat Donald Trump. That's compared to a quarter of the Democratic primary electorate. 6 in 10 of the Twitterati think that we should focus on income inequality instead of opportunity, while Democratic primary voters want to focus on expanding opportunity by 10 points. And less than a quarter of the tweeters prioritize healthcare costs or reducing taxes on the working and middle class. Those are the kitchen table issues that Democratic primary voters say matter to them most. And a full 64% think that we should #abolish ICE. So you can see this funhouse mirror effect has big implications on key issues. The most consequential is healthcare. It's an issue we know is going to drive the conversation both in the primary and in the general election. So let's dig into Medicare for All and see how this funhouse mirror effect plays out. Well, when you ask about just the idea of Medicare for All, it starts pretty high, even amongst the entire Democratic primary electorate. 65% say, sure, that sounds nice. Then you get into the details, and support begins to quickly erode. So you say, well, what about if it eliminates private insurance? That drops by 20 points. When they find out it costs $3.2 trillion a year, now we're down to 38% support. Payroll taxes are going to double, 31% support. And the most persuasive argument to me, the idea that when the GOP controls the White House and Congress, they will then be able to control all of our health care if it is run by the government, all of a sudden, less than a quarter of Democratic primary voters think that's a particularly good idea. So what happens when you just look at these tweeters? Not surprisingly, the numbers start even higher. So 82% say, I support the idea of Medicare for All. That's already quite a bit higher than the Democratic primary electorate. But here's where it gets really crazy. When they are told it will eliminate private insurance, 68% still support it. When they are told it will cost $3.2 trillion a year, 64% still support it. By this point, we are 26 points away from where the rest of the primary electorate is. When we're told it's going to double your payroll taxes, the Twitterverse says, "Meh, that seems fine." And even if you tell them Mike Pence is going to be in charge of your health care, they're still fine with it. 6 in 10 say, okay. And now they are 36 points off of where the primary electorate actually lies. So these are stunning numbers. And it is one crucial example of why we cannot fool ourselves into believing that this picture is the real picture of Democratic primary voters. So I remember waking up the day after the election in 2016, and I was stunned, particularly because I hadn't heard anyone I had met or talked to or on my social media or in my circle that liked Donald Trump, and yet he won. And I had to grapple with an important realization that day that my bubble is not representative of the general electorate. But sometimes I still get confused about that when it comes to the primary. Sometimes I still believe that the Twitterverse is in fact representative of at least primary voters, if not the general electorate. That is a crucial mistake we cannot make in 2020. I know it's tempting, it's omnipresent, it's there all the time, but we cannot allow ourselves to be drawn into the funhouse mirror. Because if we navigate by this Twitterverse, even in a primary, we could end up out of step with our own coalition and in fact help to put Donald Trump back in the White House. Thank you.